And the next one is PVC. Again, PVC is low to medium pressure. We can go up to about 300 psi is about its limit. Now it is possible to get some higher rated, especially in the smaller diameters. You can get higher pressures, but realistically for irrigation use, we're probably looking at around 300 psi as the maximum. And when you get up into the large diameter pipe, that isn't even realistic. It becomes more like 160 psi limit on the larger diameter pipes. They do make it relatively big. It is, for the size and so on, it's medium weight. It is relatively, in most sizes, inexpensive. Not cheap, but inexpensive. That trade-off comes when you get up to the bigger sizes. 12, 15 inch, all of a sudden steel starts to be competitive with PVC. Now that changes year to year. The price of oil has a large effect because PVC is polyvinyl chloride. I think I spelled that right. It's a resin. It's a plastic resin made out of petroleum. So the price of oil totally affects the price of the PVC pipe. In general, once you get to 12 inch, then you have to start comparing steel to PVC. Then they become competitive. And generally, in those smaller ranges, you can get plenty of pressure rating in the PVC for irrigation purposes. You know, we're not going to run pressures greater, hopefully, than 50, 60 psi on most systems. We're trying to keep that energy down, so we don't want to have to run real high pressures. Now, sometimes we do if we're having to pump out of a stream and push it up a very tall hill. Then we might have to overcome 200 or 300 feet of elevation difference. We might have 100, 150 feet of elevation pressure to overcome. So down at the base of the hill, just to get it to the top might take 150 psi. Then if we need 50 psi on the system on top of the hill, we're up to 200 psi. All of a sudden we're getting up to a pretty high rate of pressure on that pipe. That's where you start seeing the high pressure. Where we have the water delivery at ground level to the field, gosh, then we're usually less than, well, even on a golf course, about the highest pressure we're going to see is about 100 psi on any given golf course head, maybe 120 psi. And add up the friction loss through the fittings and valves and the little bit of elevation, you might need 160 psi rated pipe. And that's usually adequate on a golf course. And that's the higher end of pressure in the irrigation world. Most of the ag stuff is down there in the 10 to 40 psi range anymore. We've really got that ag stuff down to really low pressure. The exception would be the big gun. And there again, we might be up to the 120, 130 psi on those big Traveler big guns. And so there we would be back up to a mainline of 160 psi rated PVC. It is pretty immune to corrosion. There isn't hardly anything that you're going to pump through the water that's going to damage plastic. That isn't totally true.